Hello everyone, so today we'll be looking at resistance to social influence, and as always I'll be following along with the AQA Psychology textbook for Year 1 students with the green-haired girl on. So the things you need to know and be able to recognise, I've included the specification point here, explanations of resistance to social influence including social support and locus of control. Now what you need to know is what is meant by resistance to social influence, social support and locus of control. So we'll have a look at that. Resistance to social influence, both for conformity and obedience. And also social support and locus of control are explanations for resistance to social influence. You could get a question just saying resistance to social influence, like that in the phrasing of the question, and it would want you to be mentioning social support and locus of control. For the third bullet point, where I've put resistance to social influence, both for conformity and obedience, it's not just focusing on simply one of these, it's both. Like you can argue about how there is resistance in social influence for conformity and obedience with examples, which we'll have a look at. So what is resistance to social influence, social support and locus of control? Resistance to social influence is whereby you withstand the social pressure to conform to the majority or obey authority. Now I've emphasised or there because resistance to social influence applies to both conformity and obedience, because social influence includes both of those. Now social support, what we mean by that is by resisting the pressure to conform or obey, it helps others to do the same. So if you see somebody else doing it, it provides that social support, that support for being able to do the same as them and resist the pressure. So the people resisting act as models for others to show that resistance is possible. And we've also got locus of control. So that's the sense we have about what directs events in our lives. So there's this idea that there is a continuum, which we'll have a look at. And we have people that are internals and they're responsible for what happens to them. And then we have people called externals, and that's the idea that they believe that what happens to them is due to luck or outside factors that aren't under their control. Firstly, we have social support, and then we'll look at the evaluation for this. So this is your AO1. Now, I've tried to keep these separate. So we've got conformity and then obedience. So the information we get for conformity is that the pressure to conform can be reduced if other people who are present don't conform. So when I think of this, we've just got to think of Ash. He is talking about conformity. So when someone else gives an answer that is different to the majority, it doesn't have to be the right answer, but even if they give the wrong answer that's different to the majority, what it does is it enables people to be free to follow their own conscience. This other person is acting as a model, but if the non-conforming person starts conforming to the majority, so it says the same as what the group's saying, so does that naive participant. So what we can say is that in that example, it's not long-lasting. Then for obedience, we have if another person disobeys, the pressure reduces. So we've got to think of Milgram here with obedience. So when we think of the example when the obedience level dropped from the baseline of 65% to 10%, this was when the genuine participant was joined by a disobedient confederate. So what that person did was act as a model for that real participant to follow. And what that does is allows them to be free from their own conscience, like it does with conformity. It's all about allowing that person to be free. Another person provides that social support, allowing them to act in the way they want to. So I'll evaluate social support now. So we have research support for the resistance to conformity. So Allen and Levine in 1971 found conformity decreased when there was one dissenter in an Ash type study. And then conformity still decreased even if that dissenter wore thick glasses and said they had difficulty with their vision. So if someone's got difficulty with their vision, you're not likely really to follow them. They're not going to be able to judge the lines accurately. So you're going to think, oh, well, they're probably saying the wrong thing. But it's what we find, which is quite an interesting finding, is that resistance is not just motivated by what the person says, because they start to be freed from going along with what the group is saying because of that dissenter. It's just by having another person resist, it enables someone to be free of the pressure from the group. Furthermore, we have research support for the resistance to obedience. So here we're looking at dissenting peers in resisting obedience. So Ganson et al. In 1982 found higher levels of resistance in their study than what they do in Milgram's. So in Ganson's study, participants were in groups, and obviously in Milgram's they weren't, so it is a bit of a difference. But in Ganson's they had to produce evidence that would be used to help an oil company run a smear campaign. So what they find in the study is that 28 out of 33 groups rebelled, and so that's 80%. And what we do here is link that idea of peer support, because they're in a group, they've got the peers to support them. It's linked to that idea of greater resistance, that social support. It provides more resistance. I've now jumped back over to the AO1 for locus of control. So Rotter proposed this concept in 1966. So I'll just go back over the internals and externals. Now, as we're saying, internals think things happen to them because of their own actions. So if you do well in an exam, it's because you've put a lot of work in. Whereas externals think differently. They think that things happen to them not because of their own actions, but because of luck, or things are out of their own control. So they may blame not doing well in an exam on hard questions, or they may say, oh, the textbook wasn't very good, something like that. They won't take personal responsibility for it. Whereas if an internal didn't do well on an exam, they would accept that they didn't put enough work in. And there's this idea that we have a continuum. So we have high internal, low external, and high external. You're not just an internal or an external, you can fit somewhere on that continuum. We also have this resistance to social influence. So if you're in an internal, you're more likely to be able to resist pressures. So if a person takes more responsibility, they're more likely to resist, which makes sense. And high internals are more self-confident, are more achievement orientated, and they have a higher intelligence and less need for social approval. So now we have the evaluations. This is your AO3 marks. This links towards the locus of control. So we have research support. So there's this idea that there is a link between locus of control and resistance to obedience. And Holland in 1967 repeated Milgram's study. And what they did was measure whether participants were internals or externals. And what they found was that 37% of internals did not continue to the highest shock, so the people that take responsibility, so that don't really need social approval, whereas 23% of externals did not continue to the highest shock. So that's much lower. So it's more likely that they were sticking in it because they felt like they needed to, more so than what internals do. So what we see here is that internals showed greater resistance to authority, and therefore this increases the validity of the locus of control explanation and our confidence that it can explain resistance. A limitation is that we have contradictory research. So Twenge et al. In 2004 analysed data from locus of control studies over a 40-year period. What we find is that people have become much more resistant to obedience, but also more external. So that's a little bit confusing if the locus of control explanation is correct. What we would expect to see is that more people would be internal if there has been an increase in resistance, if that was a link to internal locus of control, but it's not what was found in that data. So what this does is challenges the link between internal locus of control and increasing resistant behaviour. But then again, the results might just be because of a change in society, due to our changing society. A final limitation is the limited role of locus of control. So the role of locus of control may have been exaggerated in resisting social influence. So Rotter 1982 points out that locus of control only comes into play in novel situations. That's when we're in new situations. It has little influence over our behaviour in familiar situations, as previous experiences are more important, and that's something that is often overlooked. So even people with really high internal locus of control are still likely to conform or obey in situations that they have done before. It's only when they're in novel situations where they won't necessarily do that. So locus of control can only explain a limited range of situations, and this means it's not as an important factor as some have suggested. So I've just had a look through old exam papers and I found this one on an AS paper 1 from June 2017. So it says Daniel and Matthew are in the same class at school but have very different views on success. Daniel is convinced that success is due to hard work and determination, whilst Matthew believes that luck and fate determine success. Now hopefully you can tell which one has got an internal and which has got an external locus of control. And you can annotate around the question as well once you figure that out. Before even reading the question, I just thought, oh, so Daniel's got an internal, Matthew's got an external, and just labelled that. The class is putting on a play and neither Daniel nor Matthew wants to participate. Their friends are trying to persuade them to take part. Using your knowledge of locus of control, identify which boy is most likely to resist the social influence of his friends. Explain why. So who's got the internal locus of control? That is Daniel. It'll be him that is more likely to be able to resist the social influence of his friends. Even just putting Daniel will resist because of his internal, you would need to explain and state that Daniel has an internal locus of control, and you need to be able to explain why that is. And you'd be able to focus on it's because they take more responsibility for themselves. And yeah, when we have a look at the mark scheme, we see that it is all AO2 marks. You need to be referring to that item, and it gives you your possible content that you can include. So I hope that's helpful. And then after that one, we also have another boy in the class. Tom refuses to take part in the play. Explain how Tom's refusal to take part might affect Daniel's and Matthew's ability to resist social influence. So here's your mark scheme for that one, and it gives you your possible content. Here it states 2 marks for a clear and coherent explanation referring to both Daniel and Matthew. 1 mark for a limited or muddled explanation or clear explanation in relation to one of the boys. You need to be able to talk about for one, and it's almost like a 1-on-1 split. Talk about Daniel, talk about Matthew. Okay, thank you for listening. I hope that was useful and best of luck with all your revision.